You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where we introduce listeners to the incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's really my pleasure to come to you with a unique story. So this is one of a continuing series of interviews here that we have done here at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. My name is Bill Alexander. I'm the Chief Executive Officer. And recurringly, we try to bring you all folks who have been connected to, who have been part of, who have spent probably the better part of their adult lives in some capacity working in the law enforcement profession, and inviting them in to tell their story. And the way I got connected to this young man is I met his son Darren, who happens to be a senior vice president at Monumental Sports and the Capitals, an organization that has been so generous to us time and again, finding ways to help support not only us specifically here at the Memorial Fund, but also law enforcement generally with Law Enforcement Appreciation Nights. Just incredibly generous. And as I was talking to Darren, he started to talk to me about his father, who has spent literally a lifetime in some capacity serving either this country or some part of the community, either nationally or locally, serving in law enforcement. Just an absolutely incredible gentleman, and I can't wait to dive into his story. So that is how I got introduced to you as an idea, and we're incredibly honored to have you here come join us. So Retired Chief Robin Montgomery, why don't you say hello and give people a sense of kind of who you are?
Hello, folks. I'm turning 80, and so if my voice cracks, that's the way it is. But I look forward to talking to Bill about my experiences. I've been lucky in the sense that I've been involved in some very noteworthy issues, and I'd like to share those with you down the road.
Well, thank you so much again for coming. It really is an honor and a pleasure to meet you. So I've interviewed a couple folks in law enforcement over the years here, and I always like to start out with this question: what is your, what I call, superhero origin story? I mean, I really do. To my bones, I feel like that men and women in uniform today are the modern day equivalent of superheroes. The major difference being they don't have S's on their chest and they aren't invulnerable to bullets, right? They are in every way vulnerable to the various violent reactions of the populace out there, and every single year face very, very real risks, as recognized across the street at the memorial, where we honor today 24,067 men and women who have died in the line of duty. But your origin story starts even before law enforcement work. I think you decided to join the military, and so I'm curious, what is the origin point for you there? Did you have an interest in the military? Did you get drafted?
No, my dad was a Army colonel, and I looked. The draft was coming down pretty quickly. I was scheduled to graduate from college in February of 1968, and in the Christmas break of '67, I signed up with the Marine Corps absent any counseling from my folks, and because their officers candidate school was only 10 weeks, and I could handle 10 weeks, I thought, and not 6 months like some of these others. So I went back and explained this to my folks, and I was a pariah after that. But what my service in Vietnam taught me was that you got to listen to folks beneath you. And I saw too many officers thought they knew everything, and they got people hurt. So I really took that away from the Marine Corps. When I left in January of '71 and joined the FBI in February of '71. But throughout my career, I always made it a point to listen to those beneath you and take their advice and their counsel, and not feel that you knew everything anyway. How's that?
No, that's great.
Okay.
I'm curious, were you, to some degree, and I know you were saying that sort of jokingly, a pariah in your family because you had joined the Marines specifically? Was your father disappointed that you had not gone into a different branch, or was it some other reason?
There's always a reason. There was always, I think it was the lack of counseling or discussing with my parents about my next step. But I felt it was something that I wanted to do on my own, and that to get through, I wanted to do it on my own. So they were surprised, needless to say, and it was a happy Christmas after that.
Yeah, I was in the Air Force. I joined the Air Force, and so now when I think back to my time, which I was not in any combat situation, my mind immediately gloms onto the typical living conditions of, say, an E1 enlisted airman, as I was called at the time, versus some of my peers who were in the Army or Marines at the time. And I knew guys who had recently graduated from both the Army and Marines, and they were still living in open bays after they had gotten their first assignment, right? Mm-hmm. Open bay being like a big cavernous room with 50 other guys sleeping in bunks, right? And I, as an E1 in the Air Force, had my own room with my own bathroom. I was like king of the E1s compared to some of my peers in the Army and the Marines. So even now, when people ask me what branch they should go in, I say, well, I've been gone for 20 years, but if it's anything like it was 30 years ago, you do not want to join the Marines or the Army, because you'll be living with 50 other guys for the first year or something. So, but there's no question that to some degree, choosing to join the Marines, knowing that you are going to be at the tip of the spear, that you are going to be the first one thrown into real world combat situations while the Vietnam War is going on, that takes a level of altruism and, really hearty patriotism, recognizing that there, certainly at that time, there was an incredible risk that you might not make it home, right?
Oh, there's no doubt. And I've got the holes to prove it. But I think my impetus was doing something to demonstrate that I could do it, and I'd been a dependent for 22 years, and this was my chance of doing something very hard on my own, and that's how I looked at it. And I think that helped get through some of the things that I had to get through in Vietnam, to be honest with you.
Yeah, well, if you're comfortable talking about it, why don't we dive into that? I know that you got 2 Purple Hearts and the Navy Cross, one of the highest honors that the Navy bestows upon its members. And I know you rushed a couple of machine gun emplacements to help save your men, to rally them and save them. So to the extent you can talk about it, I'd love to hear the story.
Well, I'm not going to go into the machine gun stuff because it brings back memories I don't need.
I completely understand.
But I will tell you that that day, my battalion was moving from one point to another, and I was in charge of the mortars, 81 mortars, and the whole move stopped all of a sudden because the platoon that was leading had the point wasn't going anywhere, and my CEO said, "Go down and see what the hell's going on," basically, and it was my old platoon. When I first got there. And I basically had to chew out another lieutenant who was trying to bring in artillery by sound rather than seeing where it was landing. And everybody was just stopped dead in their tracks. So I had to basically tell this guy, stand by, I'm taking over this thing, and kind of made a move across a rice paddy, and everybody got to a point where no one was hurt or no incoming, and I just had a radio man with me, but I did have some frag grenades, and but got up very close to where the enemy was, and the next thing I know, the lieutenant is calling all his troops back. So I'm left out there in the middle of this thing with my radio man and myself. And when I got shot, my radio man froze, and he had a grenade in his hand, and it yeah, I mean, it was not a good deal. But that's what I experienced. And then got the only thing that was beneficial to me was that I knew I'd be getting out of country. But that's how that all panned out. And here I am.
Well, I've read a little bit about your story, and I'm more than blown away. I mean, to me, it's men like you who exemplify what it means to be an American and what it means to give back to your country in ways that are very hard to describe, particularly for World War II people who have not served in the military before. And I really am honored to meet you here and hear even a part of your story. I mean, the reality is that you exemplify the very best of what it means to be an American, and you are a hero in every sense of the word I have ever heard it used or might use it myself, including in terms of the men and women whose names adorn our very sacred walls across the street on the memorial. So I'm incredibly, incredibly thankful that men like you existed then and to hopefully to some degree still exist today.
I'm sure they do.
In an effort to serve our country. So thank you for your service. Thank you for serving in Vietnam, and thank you for telling a little bit of that story here today.
Well, and the biggest thing to me afterwards, I went to a reunion where my squad leaders had brought their wives, and the wives cornered me in one room and basically tearfully said, thanks for keep bringing my guys home. And, that to me is really the height of everything.
Yeah, well, there's just no question. I've read the story. You did bring your guys home, and it's a tribute to you and your patriotism and your heroism. So thank you again. So you leave the Marine Corps, and you ultimately joined the FBI. I'm curious, had there been any train of thought before in
Negative,
your life?
No train of thought, and that continues today, believe me. What happened is that my last assignment in the Marine Corps, I was in charge of troops at the firearms range in Quantico.
Okay.
And that's where the FBI did their firearms training, because the Jefferson building or the Quantico had not been built yet. And so a couple of the instructors asked what I was doing when I was getting out, and I said, I don't know. And they said, have you thought of the FBI? And I said, no, you have to be an accountant and an attorney. And they said, no, you don't. And I said, well, that's news to me. And they said, we'll handle it. So they got they kind of ran with my application when you get.
Sure.
And luckily, I think during that time period, Congress had passed a law allowing the FBI to hire 1,000 additional agents at that time. And so I came in under that. And, as far as any forethought, I have none. And these two guys can tell you that today I'm pretty reactive to things. So that's how I got involved with the FBI.
So, well, that's a very interesting origin story in terms of the FBI. And now you've been hired by the FBI. What is the track there? Do you have any specific interest? Are you aiming to get in a specific, say, task force or a specific kind of crime, or you just follow the path?
I'm kind of following the path, and I thought that I had things in my own mind figured out because the Marine Corps owed me a move back to Seattle. So I said, that's where the FBI is going to send me. I ended up in Baltimore. So there's a clue there. I have to pick up on that. So I ended up in Baltimore as a first office agent. And at that time, you were bound to spend a year in your first office, and then you would get transferred. And at that time, a number of agents were getting transferred to New York. Hoover was the director, and he did not like people going back to their home of record, if you will, because you would be suspect or susceptible to some sort of
grift or graft.
Grift and graft, yeah. So Baltimore was my first office, and I was involved with the Wallace shooting with Bremer, having to take him to, after we arrested him, taking him to the psych ward, locking him up. And then I had to go and kind of guard him at the psych ward because I think the psychiatrists need to be in the cell right next to him. Some of them, they had some real strange ideas on what was going on, and so that was my first experience, kind of a national perspective, dealing with Wallace and Arthur Bremer.
And so, for our audience, you're referencing George Wallace, who at the time was a presidential candidate,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
He had been if I remember
governor.
Right, he had a governor from
of
Alabama.
Yes.
And then was a presidential candidate and got shot by Arthur Bremer.
Yes.
And so you were guarding Bremer as he was awaiting trial?
Yeah, and his psych analysis. So that was my role at that time. But I was involved in something. I think what I took away from my first year is that you volunteered to do things, and you didn't, wait to be assigned anything. And I think management saw that, they didn't need to tell me what to do, that I would volunteer for things at every angle, and you learn that way. And so that's what I did there. And I didn't go to New York, my second office. I went to Omaha.
On purpose?
No, nothing's on purpose. We got to get that straight. There's nothing on purpose. No, not on purpose. But what's interesting is that I was assigned there in 1972. This is where both these guys were born. In 1972, and in 1973, Wounded Knee occurred, where the American Indian movement took over a post office and some other things, and the FBI obviously is in charge of crimes on an Indian reservation. So we had a huge force up there, and really not knowing what we were doing when you get right down to it, because at that time negotiations had not been really experienced. The FBI had no SWAT teams. These were all folks were street agents in their fedoras getting up into South Dakota in the middle of winter. And I saw at that point, they gave out M16s to folks that never used them.
Wow.
And they, when you mentioned, well, where's the Army? Well, there's no Army. You just lock it up on the radiator at your hotel.
Wow.
So, and I luckily I became friends with a couple of instructors from Quantico, and I mentioned, I'm sure others did too, but I mentioned how stupid this whole drill was with people that didn't know the front end from the back end of an M16, and I gave them an example of me driving back to my hotel with an agent in the back seat. And I heard the slide go home in the M16, and I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I just want to shoot this thing. I've never shot one." I said, "Do you know what happens when you shoot an M16 in a car and the cartridge goes right down my back?" So I mean, all these stupid things you saw. So what's interesting, I kept in touch with those guys, and ultimately a SWAT team was established, the SWAT team program. And that's something that LAPD had already done, and they were well known for that. But in 1975, the two agents, Ronald Williams and Jack Kohler, were investigating a crime on an Indian reservation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and came under fire by a group of outsiders, Indians, AIM folks, American Indian Movement folks, and one of them was Leonard Peltier. And both agents were wounded and had put their hands up and were shot point blank by Peltier. And when my SWAT team got there, their bodies were still on the ground, and the Indians were moving away from the incident. And one of the agents in charge said, "Why don't we get some horses and go after them?" I mean, again, it took me right back to Wounded Knee, some of the things that people were talking about, silliness. And then they said, well, we got to call in some investigators. And I remember standing up because I had nothing to lose, saying, what the hell do you think we are? We're investigators. And so we stayed, the SWAT teams that were there stayed and investigated the entire case. And my role there was to go and dig for evidence underneath where the bodies were found. And that's where I found some expended cartridge that could be attributed to the M16 that Pelletier had.
Wow.
And so that, when I saw what Biden had done, I mean, it was like a shot in the, it was horrible because he had not, Pelletier had killed a police officer also, and there was no remorse with him, but that was in 75.
Yeah, so of course, when you referenced most recently President Biden just a minute ago, you and I are talking now right in March of 2025, but just a few months ago, then President Biden pardoned
Leonard Peltier.
And it really was a topic of conversation, I think, across law enforcement. There were very strong feelings on, say, our side of the fence there about how that was what we viewed very strongly was an inappropriate pardon for sure.
And we had the case had been to the appeals court 3 times or 4 times, and had been blessed every time that the FBI had done the right thing, and there was ample cause for what was taking place. But I remember every year this would surface, and you would write a letter to the president,
sure,
explaining that.
Well, you mentioned if we roll back the clock just a little bit, you mentioned sort of standing up this SWAT team. I suspect most of our audience is familiar with the term SWAT, being Special Weapons and Tactics. If you're starting from scratch like that, what was the plan you put in place to sort of get that going? I have to imagine that involved quite a bit of work. You were getting excess military gear and training. But what was happening is that management were hesitant to use folks like the SWAT team because they felt they were bloodthirsty animals, so to speak. And so you had to prove, on various methods that you weren't going to screw things up or, and you were, again, an FBI agent first. And right.
So
they wanted to be cautious of the Clint Eastwood types, the cowboys who might go off on their own
Absolutely.
Or stretch the limits of their otherwise authorized authority. Right.
And that hasn't changed, as you well know. But that was the reason they weren't used effectively early on, but it progressed eventually.
Right.
Yeah.
And now today, I view the FBI and their sort of hostage negotiator crisis response team as one of the best in the world. So you must be, I would think that you're incredibly proud to have started from a seed, basically, starting a unit, a sub-organization within the FBI, which has gone on to perhaps lead the world in those kinds of training, tactics, experiential responses to critical incidents. I mean, that's just an incredible contribution to law enforcement globally, I might say.
Well, thank you. And, people that are on the SWAT team are not only physically sound, but they're mentally sound as well. And there's a lot of checks and balances that go into getting somebody in that position. Then in 80, so I was doing regular FBI work in Omaha until 79, when I was transferred to the Washington field office. And one of the things I wanted to do was to get into management in some way, shape, or form, and you had to go to a big office to do that. And when I landed at Washington field office, I was assigned a special. GSA was having a lot of problems with corruption. And I was in a special a special group that were investigating attorneys that were involved in that. And ultimately, we, after about a year, we convicted a number of them, or one important one, for sure, in New Jersey court. So I ended up getting a promotion, and I give you an aside. At the trial, the defense attorney and the defendant were Jewish, and so they had asked that there be no trial on Friday so they could get back to D.C. before dark, and the judge allowed that. And then in November, the Marine Corps birthday occurred. November 10th was a Wednesday, and I made a motion in court that we be allowed to leave in honor of the Marine Corps birthday, and that's in the court record. That did happen.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I love that. What a cool detail. So you have gone from the Marines to Baltimore and the FBI to
Yep.
Omaha, and you haven't mentioned it yet, but I assume at some point during this lifelong adventure, you meet someone who then helps you raise at least 2 sons. Do you have any more kids besides
I do.
Eric and
Now let's
Darren?
not get it. These are from my first wife,
Okay.
and my second wife. I have a 31 and a 33-year-old.
Wow. So in these early days, are your kids a factor? I have to assume that, even as a police officer and you have a family and you miss many of the sort of seminal events, you miss birthdays, you miss holidays to some degree, right? But if you're a local police officer, there's very little risk that you're going to get sent from Baltimore to Omaha, right? But as a federal agent, much like the men and women who serve in the military who could get stationed anywhere in the world, that must have been a factor in sort of your bringing up your family, having a family, that being a consideration, worrying about relocating your family from one place to another.
Well, again, that requires forethought, right? And
you're still on the path.
I'm still trying to figure that out. But they had great schools they went to in Virginia. And the thing I remember most is we lived on a cul-de-sac, was throwing the football to both of them and see the fights that occurred as a result of that, But
they seem so kind and cordial now.
They are.
I'm not sure what happened.
But so ended up in running a public corruption desk.
Okay.
Looking at corrupt congressmen, and Abscam had just occurred, where you had an undercover agent video a U.S. senator taking bribes, so that was in vogue. And then while doing that, President Reagan was shot, and Director Webster at the time was trying to get approval from the Secret Service director to let the 2 FBI agents, that was going to be myself and another agent, to interview Reagan as a pro forma type thing. I mean, we had to do that because we had
check the box.
Check the box, exactly. And so that was kind of a dance for a while between the two, and ultimately we got approval to do that. And I can remember Ed Meese was former Attorney General in California, and was one of 3 individuals advising President Reagan. And he basically put the word out, there'll be no interviews with the press. But the press was, as you know, lined up waiting for something. And so we went in, and Meese, this is kind of an aside, the director had an example of the type of bullet that had shot Reagan.
Right.
In a glass encased thing that the laboratory had made, which I thought, by myself, I wouldn't think I'd be showing somebody that had been shot, this is what got you right here. But the director said he wanted to present that, and me said, that's great. you've got 5 minutes to do that. These agents have as long as they need. And so that kind of turned things upside down. But Reagan was just like you'd see him on TV. He was in bed. This is before they realized how serious it was. I can remember there was not supposed to be any Secret Service agents in there or anybody from the White House. But when we stepped in, there was the lead Secret Service agent that was his bodyguard, basically, and a fellow from the White House. We decided we just got to go through with this thing, and I'd make a big issue out of it. And Reagan was very conversant. He said things like this happen in California, but and I can remember him asking for a glass of water, and I'm looking at the Secret Service agent and the White House guy just sitting there. And so I went and gave him a glass of water. The thing that we took away from the interview was the fact that he normally stood on the running board of the car to wave at the crowds across the street. And so this had not been, we did not think, a planned, organized hit. And that's exactly what took place. Hinckley was just, we know the history on that. But that was the big takeaway, is that it wasn't an organized thing that took place. And as a result of that, we changed some rules for the FBI to let the Secret Service, when they came into town, let them look at kind of we have a nut file, basically. People call in or
sure, yeah.
And we let them peruse that and make some changes if they needed to, but that changed the way we did business with the Secret Service then. I was then, after that, promoted to the inspection staff. And so you'd go and do inspections of field offices that they're complying with rules and regs, stuff like that. And during that time, I was made what they call the Secretary of the Career Board. In other words, I had to prepare the documentation for executives to promote certain individuals, and then do background and be able to explain, some of the nuances of some of the folks they were looking at.
Sure.
So I did that without getting too whacked. So my next assignment was Philadelphia as the number 2 guy. And this is when the mob was big in Philly and had just been in the process of being taken down. And I was also involved with the public corruption element there. And as an aside, we ended up putting wires, overhears in judges' courtroom or in their inner sanctum, capturing them throwing cases for money, basically. So we arrested 11 local judges that had been elected, and Philly was always a good ground for things like that.
This doesn't sound like the Philly I know. I'm not familiar with the place you're describing.
Well, yeah, right. And then we had I think it was 1987, the bicentennial event in Philadelphia, where you brought in everybody and you had to do a real command post exercise, which I was involved in. So I was somewhat familiar on what you had to put together to address those issues. And then ultimately was promoted to D.C. as in charge of what they call the violent crime section. And it was under my watch that we had to change. We changed. They were doing some things that didn't make sense, so we kind of combined those under one umbrella and to make it work more effectively. And a couple of things that occurred while I was there, we had what they call Van Pack. That was our code name for a case where not a congressman, but he was a a state representative had been killed by a mail bomb. And so we were trying to determine what that was all about. And we ended up getting Louis Free, who was an attorney at that time, being a special attorney on this case. And the agent that was in charge of that became his right-hand man. And the case was ultimately resolved, and we arrested the guy, and we had him locked up. And to Freeze, a very creative guy, we were able to put a wire in the cell, and we heard this guy confess to himself what he had done, basically. So we were able to use that, and so that was really the highlight of some of the things that I did. But so
a self-confession, not even you didn't even need a cellmate. He's just confessing to himself.
After my headquarters stint, I was assigned to run the Portland office of the FBI.
Well, hold on. Before you get into Portland, if I may.
Yeah.
If I'm reading the sort of breadcrumbs correctly, you are clearly someone that the FBI leadership has an eye on in terms of recognizing that you are a leader, recognizing that you are a guy who can get things done. In fact, maybe that, both of us, I'm sure, can recognize the so-called curse of competence, where the guy or girl who can get things done oftentimes gets the unwanted assignment.
Sure.
I mean, they've trusted you to interview the president, right? You've started the FBI's SWAT team. You're getting some pretty serious assignments, like Philadelphia, the second in charge. Now you've gone to D.C. Is it even on your mind that you are perhaps being groomed to some degree to take on more and more leadership in the FBI, or you're still just on the path following whatever they laid out?
I'm still reactive in nature. That was the next step, was to take over an office, because I'd been number 2 in one. And
sure.
What headquarters didn't know is that I had relatives in Portland, and if they had known that, I think I would have ended up in Timbuktu somewhere.
I was just getting ready to ask if you had asked if you wanted to go to Portland, or voluntold.
I was told that, so
But you secretly wanted to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And while in Portland is when Ruby Ridge occurred, and but prior to that, I had been very much involved with the hostage rescue team as far as their personnel was concerned, because I was career board secretary. And what I tried to implement was the fact that just because you had guys that were trained killers didn't mean that they didn't know what the hell they were doing in the investigative world.
Sure.
And so a lot of promotions that took place with some of those folks that had raised their hand to go and leave the hostage rescue team and go into administrative work. So I felt good about, dissuading management that you just had a bunch of knuckleheads with automatic weapons, But Ruby Ridge occurred, and my office was being inspected, and I got a call to get on an airplane and get to Idaho overnight, and picked up by an agent and driven to Ruby Ridge and it was like the third largest city in Idaho, with all the you had the state police, you had the FBI, you had the Marshal Service, you had I think some ATF. So, I mean, it was tent city. And one of the issues that came up right away was the rules of engagement. And this is where I think you saw something kind of went haywire.
Well, before I'm really interested to hear, but before, just for the audience, so for those who may not be familiar, Ruby Ridge, you're referencing Randy Weaver, who's something of a isolationist. He's got a wife and some children.
Yes.
He lives on a very isolated patch of land, mountainous region. To some degree, if I'm and audience, please forgive me if I'm messing up the details, but to some degree, he is bouncing into or out of some level of white supremacist groups,
Some
right?
level, yeah, and we didn't really know what that was, and I think ATF had made a gun charge on him, and that's
right. He gets ultimately charged with selling, I think, sawed-off shotguns, right?
Yeah.
And then there's some degree of
And
conflict about was it enticed or
yeah, but not only that, he didn't show up for a court appearance.
right. He missed a court appearance,
and so they put a warrant out for him. And the
someone
fact
tries
is,
to go serve the warrant or get him, and
so ATF had a surveillance around this to try to make sure they could catch him without a firefight, so to speak. And what happened is that his son Sammy had a dog that one day lit up on these agents, ATF agents that were in the field that were kind of moving around the woods,
trying to be stealthy and
and
observation post kind of stuff, and they get caught.
They got caught, and so Weaver and I forget the name of the guy that was with him. And
is it Hayes or Haynes?
I don't remember. But his son Sammy raced after these folks, and that's when the shooting started.
Right.
And one of the ATF agents was, now that I'm was it Marshals, U.S. Marshals, because they had the arrest authority. One of the U.S. Marshals, Deegan, I think was his last name, was killed at that point. And there was a firefight, and that's when the head of the Marshals called then Director Sessions to send the hostage rescue team there because there was a huge firefight. And the problem was you were killing an ant with an elephant, so to speak. Cops on a day-to-day basis do entries into homes,
dynamic entries or something else?
entries, and there were no hostages involved. And that's what the hostage rescue team was meant to do.
Sure.
So
because you're saying the family, they weren't being held hostage. They were there voluntarily. Right. They were there of their own free will. In fact, did not want to leave. Very much wanted to stay with their patriarchal figure in Randy Weaver.
And what had happened is one of the hostage rescue team snipers fired on Weaver because the rules of engagement at that time, and it was proven wrong down the road, that if you saw somebody with a weapon, you could open fire. I remember hearing that discussion and saying, I'm not doing that, because I was ending up right outside the cabin. I said, we use the regular FBI policy of if someone's life's in danger, that's when you do it. But so I stood by that, and it was recorded like that. So Weaver is wounded and runs into the house. I think 2 shots were fired, and we start negotiations, or to try to start negotiations, if you will. And I went to the lead negotiator and said, let's get going. And he said, I'm getting pressured by the hostage rescue team leader. They're handling this. And so I said, wait a minute. So I had to counsel the hostage rescue team leader at that time on what was going to take place. And we began the negotiations, which were futile, basically. But that night, we had to move some of the outlying cabins away from the house so we had a better view. And sending a couple of hostage rescue team guys in there to start that process, we get a call back that there's a body in here, and it was Weaver's son was dead. So that was a real eye-opener to see this 11-year-old, kind of a real emaciated kid, was dead, and it was a real tough time for everybody. And we went through the negotiation stuff, with the throw phones and, the best we could. And there was, we weren't making any headway. We even brought his sister in from Iowa to talk to him, and he wouldn't listen to her. During that time, I think a group that was being led by a guy by the name of Bo Greitz out in the outer perimeter really didn't like what was going on and wanted they had their own arrest warrant for Director Sessions, and it was one of those things. But Randy Weaver was willing to talk to Bo Greitz.
And I think, if I'm remembering right, Bo was associated with Special Forces, right? He had
some
link.
He was.
And Randy also.
I don't know if that's accurate, but Bo was a lieutenant colonel, retired in Special Forces, and but again, he was running this.
Sure, not representing, say, the modern day or at the time U.S. government or branch of military, but someone who Randy clearly had some potential connection with and maybe trusted more than the FBI.
And so my job was to convince management back in D.C. to let Bo Greitz do that, to go in and to try to convince Randy to come out.
Well, that's a massive leap of faith on your part,
It
because
is.
it could have gone sideways,
Well,
right?
here's
Bo
what
could
he
have gotten
did.
in there and said, we're going to Alamo this thing to the last man.
Yeah. But so he came up to where I was, and it was at night, and he was in a Jeep. I got in the Jeep with him, and we both regaled our Vietnam experiences.
Okay.
And that was a real connection. And, I mentioned at the end that, he needed to follow the game plan and not do anything offline, so to speak. And he did just that. And ultimately, everybody came out, after 10 days, thanks to him. And he brought a buddy up, a former police officer from, I think, Arizona, to help. But that was the first time that the FBI were using somebody besides FBI negotiators. So it was a leap of faith, so to speak, but it worked.
Yeah.
And I was very critical of the FBI's role in that whole process. And I wrote a scathing memorandum laying out the steps that I saw wrong. And apparently that document was deep sixed before it got to people that could make a decision. Because the same issues that I saw, which was don't put a dynamic group like the hostage rescue team in a stationary situation, because that's not what they're trained to do. And you can do, SWAT teams can stand in a foxhole and keep an eye on something, and some other issues that I had. But those same issues occurred at Waco, which was 6 months later. And I was never contacted during that whole thing. And once it was over, I was asked by the deputy director of the FBI if I would be interested in trying to stand up something called the Critical Incident Response Group, because Congress was about ready to take away the FBI's ability to do tactical things. They were very upset with that whole process.
Right.
And so I had to go back and I had to interview with the Attorney General, Janet Reno. And she was a former local prosecutor in Florida, outstanding woman and very smart. And after we discussed things, she said, what can I do to help you? And I said, you can stop the track meet to your office by the heads of these agencies, because by the time they get here, things have changed. And so she would contact me directly and kind of circumvent the chain of command in a way, just to get an idea of what was really going on. And so Congress wanted the FBI to change the way you do business, and that's how the Critical Incident Response Group was formed. And today, I think we had 105 people at that time. I think today it's at 800, something like that.
Wow.
Because they have additional assignments. But and this goes back to my Vietnam days. My main mission for that was to serve the field and to give them as much support as possible with the expertise we had. So I would send people out to the field, didn't have to make it a big deal, to do command post exercises and behavioral issues, explain some of those things. And then I retired in 97. Oh, and then I know what I was going to tell you. In 96, we had the Freeman situation out in Montana, where these folks had taken over a farm and were basically weren't supposed to be there and wouldn't come out. So we had another hostage or a crisis situation, if you will, and we were able to put together the lessons learned in Waco by rotating SWAT teams in 2 weeks at a time to stand guard, basically. We had agents dressed in blue jeans and not in khakis or military equipment. We painted anything that looked like a military equipment. We painted them blue. And so it was a 180 from what they saw at Waco.
Sure.
And Waco was the longest siege at 51 days, and this thing lasted 83. But no one was killed. Everybody came out peacefully, and we did some unique things. I think one of the unique things was that, am I boring you guys yet?
No.
No, I'm not. I'm talking to my boys. Anyway, one of the things we did, one of the leaders in this group said that they would consider surrendering if they could talk to their leader, who was in jail in oh God, I forget which town.
Somewhere in the federal system.
Well, no, it was a local system.
Local.
Yeah, in a town in Montana. I can't remember the name, darn it. I can remember calling the director at home, explaining this whole thing to him and having him say, so you want me to authorize you to fly somebody that's in there out to talk to their leader and then fly them back in? And I said, yeah, that's it. And he gave me the green light to do that. And we did that. And that's what broke the ice on this whole thing. Basically, we flew the individual up to it was either Billings or someplace in Montana, and he got to talk in jail with his leader, so to speak, and agreed that they would surrender as long as their documentation was safe. And I omitted the fact that we had some attorneys that were volunteered to come out that were actually attorneys against the FBI at Waco, but wanted to help resolve this thing. And I said, come on down. And they were very instrumental because they understood the Christian issues and all these other things in helping you get it resolved. But it was ultimately resolved in 83 days with and no deaths. And I think what's ironic, I had to testify at Congress a number of times, and always the impetus was safety. No, you got to keep it. And so I had to go back, and I testified no one was hurt. But then they said, how much did it cost? And so I just looked at myself and said, you got to be shitting me. Anyway, but that's it in a nutshell. How about that? That took you through 26 years.
You're in Portland as the SAC, Special Agent in Charge. You go through Ruby Bridge. You don't respond to Waco, but certainly being in the FBI, you're given your role and your history there, you're familiar with the sort of broad issues facing Waco. And for our audience, I suspect most of them are aware, but we are collectively referencing David Koresh and the Branch Davidian crisis. And certainly on the backs of Ruby Ridge and Waco, the FBI was certainly under some level of scrutiny, both from Congress and, from the populace at large, right? There was a lot of questions, maybe some blame, maybe not appropriately placing blame on the FBI, but certainly the FBI was getting a lot of heat about what the broad public felt like the response was, and why are these people dying, and why are these situations going south. And sitting here now, I'm not putting my thumb on the scale. I'm not attributing any of that blame to the FBI. I'm just trying to give our audience a sense of what the issues were. And then FBI leadership comes to you on the backs of those two major incidents and says, again, they're coming to the guy, the curse of competence. Robin Montgomery might be the guy who can help us fix this thing. They say to you, stand up this crisis intervention response group. And where do you stay in Portland for that, or do you come back to DC?
Back to DC, back to Quantico, actually. I took over somebody's office and people were scattered all over the place. We didn't have one focal point at all. So I did a lot of management by walking around, basically. But I had two guys, my assistants, that really kept things on the right track, and I've been told they still use some of the memos that we wrote for procedures today.
I was just getting ready to say, I suspect that the bones of what you put in place there still resonate today through the men and women who are working in that very same subsection of the FBI. What an absolutely amazing career just in the FBI. It's absolutely astonishing. There are very few people in, I think, our broad career field who have had anything close to the career that you have had. Touchstoning across these major incidents. You're almost like the Forrest Gump of law enforcement. Is this an ongoing joke with your son?
No,
the Forrest Gump. Yeah.
I came to Eric's office and spoke to the agents there. I think they said, you remember your dad's a Forrest Gump?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's not a bad analogy because, somehow in the fictional movie of Forrest Gump, he keeps landing on these seminal moments across U.S. history. And in law enforcement history, you have certainly touched on quite a few that have been absolutely instrumental. So, okay, you leave the FBI in 1997, you said?
Yes.
And you're retiring from the FBI, and you don't immediately say, I'm going to retire and spend the rest of my life playing golf, or,
I'm only 52 or something like that.
So you have now left the FBI, and you decide to do what?
Well, I end up in a corporate world in Connecticut as the director of corporate security.
Okay.
The company that I was working for ended up being sold out within 2 years, and I left and went back to Brookfield, was where I was, and I was contacted by the head of the police commission to see if I'd even be interested in the police chief's role, because the police chief had been forced to retire. He had done some things that were not acceptable, and I threw my hat in the ring and ultimately was selected. And again, I hearkened back to Vietnam. I listened to what the troops were saying. And what was happening is that their input wasn't taken. And the former chief was a state police trooper, and they're somewhat regimented.
Sure.
And
out of all the law enforcement agencies, I think state troopers generally are even more paramilitary than most city, town, county agencies.
Yeah. And so I kind of opened the door and let listen to folks and made some changes. And I had one day to determine who my number two guy was going to be, because they had basically fired the number two guy also. And so I interviewed 3 people and selected the individual that ended up with me for 16 years. Outstanding.
Wow.
Yeah. But I had, a nanosecond to do all this, and I didn't know the background of anybody.
Give the audience a sense. What size town is Brookfield, Connecticut? What size is the department?
It's about a 40-person police officers.
Okay. 40 sworn.
40 sworn, and it's about an 18 to 20,000 population in the town. And so I was able to get that kind of shared information going throughout the building. And then I was able to start some community policing things.
Yeah.
And then in 2012, Sandy Hook happened. And
it seems crazy, absolutely crazy to me that here you are having, been intimately involved in any number of really high-profile incidents in the FBI, where certainly you were exposed to, what I think any of us might agree is pretty traumatic incidents, and certainly seeing some of the worst of human behavior. You have now retired from a major law enforcement position to take what you might have thought of at the time as sort of this sort of sleepy town in Connecticut where, I'm guessing there are very few, if any, murders, and you think I'm going to continue on in my twilight years, still giving back to the community to some degree, but probably not anticipating anything close to Sandy Hook. And then you wake up one morning and like a 2x4 to the face.
Yeah,
there you are.
And tell you how bad it was. The parents that we brought in could only identify their kids by the clothes they were wearing. I mean, it was
that's heart-wrenching.
It was awful. And my role at the time was to take over Newtown's police activities because the chief there was really the one that was involved in oversight of the whole crisis management stuff. And so I remember on a Christmas day going to Newtown and, managing the patrolling stuff
sure,
like
calls
that.
for service, 911 calls,
absolutely.
normal law enforcement
stuff.
function.
Absolutely. And then I got a call that one of the fathers of the slain kids wanted to come to see the playground at the school on, I don't know if it was Christmas Day or right before Christmas. And I volunteered to do that because I didn't feel right appointing somebody to do something like that. So I drove out and picked up the dad and had brief conversations. It was awkward, obviously, and I drove to the school. And he got out and walked around the playground, and he said, "This is where my son had his best times, right here." And you can imagine what that is to you. But he thanked me profusely for bringing him there, and then I took him back home. Before he got out of the car, he gave me a $50 bill and said, "Please buy your kids something for Christmas." So
rips your heart out.
Yeah, it does.
I would have been really worried, and maybe you were too. I would have been really worried that he might have had some motive to maybe take his own life or do something dramatic after you got him there to the scene.
Yeah, I'm reactive. I didn't have forethought to that.
Wow. So, and then you continue to serve there as chief for a number of years. When did you retire from there?
I retired in 2017.
Okay.
After 16 years there, 17 years. So
wow.
Total law enforcement time is 42 years.
And the second in command, who you picked almost on a lark for a very brief interview, did he or she assume command?
He did, and that was a testament to what we had done, And then his number two has now assumed the role of the chief.
Oh, wow.
Which, the succession process, said something about the changes that the police had made and what they're doing differently, that kind of thing.
I've long said, and I've been a believer in that, my feeling generally is, and certainly the audience knows I've been in law enforcement before, that generally I feel like if a police department is on the right track or perceived to be on the right track, I think the best option is to pick someone who is internal to the organization. But if the organization is facing some trouble or perceived to be, not on the beaten path, that you pick someone from outside. So I think in a really, really big way, it speaks to you and your leadership ability and your leadership style and grooming the leaders underneath you. That there was some problem with the agency, right? They bring in a guy from the outside. Here's Chief Montgomery. He's starting a whole new program, community-oriented policing, listening to the folks down at the bottom of the chain. And here it is, 25 plus years later, and they have not made a change from the original structure and bones and programs and processes you put in place 25 years ago. I think that really does speak to your efforts and the extent of your involvement in terms of leadership in the organization.
Well, thank you. That's it.
Well, that's not it, because you're still kicking around. You got your kids here. You got your 2 sons here.
Oh,
you're in town visiting your grandkids, right?
Absolutely.
Well, let me ask you this. I am very fortunate. I'm incredibly fortunate to be here at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum most days. I get to walk the very sacred walls outside where men and women, some of which I know you know and some of which I know, whose names are out there adorning the walls. You know, law enforcement has been the bulk of my adult life, much like yours. And I feel so passionate about law enforcement. I feel so thankful that there are men and women who are willing and able to do the job that you and I have done for the better part of our lives, right? Including one of your sons who's sitting right here. You know, sound a note of optimism to the audience. To some degree, over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, there has certainly been a movement, a groundswell, a conversation, whether that's on social media, popular media, you know, maybe even from a worrying degree, too many of our elected officials who I might argue have sought to demonize, sought to place perhaps an unfair level of blame on what I view so closely as our profession, right? So sound a note of optimism for the audience. What are your feelings about law enforcement, both past and present?
Well, they're great people, and females are becoming more prevalent in law enforcement, and they're very good, and but they're still a reticent to hire or a reticent to even ask to be hired because of what you're seeing in this country right now. You know, I'm up there where the New York press is prevalent, and some of the things you see. You know, an officer puts their life on line, and next thing you know, the person that he's arrested is on the street the following day, and so it's very tough to encourage someone to look at that as a career. But the quality of people that end up doing that is very high, and I'm very proud to have done that. Those 17 years with the local police.
Well, that leads us to my final typical question. I ask the same question of all of the guests that I get the opportunity to interview, and that question is there a question you wish I had asked you that I did not? Is there some story you wanted to tell? Is there some tidbit, some anecdote you said, boy, if he asked me this, I'm going to knock it out of the park? And it's okay if the answer is no.
The answer is no, because I'd be throwing names out, and I don't want to do that. I think the biggest thing that I've shared with you was the fact that I was very critical of my own agency, and my criticisms were, again, tossed and not given up to the food chain, so to speak. And I will also tell you that the person that deep sixed those ended up in prison for violating the very 1001, lying to the FBI. The individual lied, about the whole process, and that hurt. That hurt because if we had addressed those issues, Waco would not have looked like it would. But because you needed outside religious experts doing the negotiations with Koresh, and as a result of that, we now are hooked into religious crisis response folks. So that's a positive thing. That's the only thing that I could think of that I've shared with you that was kind of tough. I will tell you, maybe this, when the Freeman thing broke out in this no man's land in Idaho, the first two people to walk in my door was Randy Weaver and Bo Greitz, want to know what they could do to help.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow. See, that's the exact kind of cool tidbit that I love to hear about on these podcasts. You would just never hear that detail anywhere else.
Yeah.
Oh, what an amazing.
And here you go. You got me started now reacting. At the end, everything was looking good. We were going to, except the sheriff up there felt he had ownership to the property and was doing some things that was making people not want to turn themselves in. And we got that information from an NBC reporter that knew me from Portland, because he had a young kid, as did I, and we had shared that during the Tanya Harding debacle.
Oh, yeah.
And so he called and said, hey, this is what's happening. You need to address this. And we addressed it, and things went okay. But, I mean, that shows you how the personal relationships can end up in, places you wouldn't think of, basically.
Wow. Absolutely amazing. Well, before we go, I'm going to ask your sons, while we have your father under the hot, glaring interrogation lights of our podcast room, is there something you wish I had asked him to get him on the record? He's forced to tell the truth here. Is there something you wish I had asked?
Second generation FBI. Isn't there something in your post-FBI career, you've done a lot with recruiting, and where do you see the direction of recruiting for law enforcement, and how do leaders in law enforcement position the profession to attract top talent?
See, I was an adjunct professor at Western Connecticut State University in the police, not the police academy, but it was the law enforcement venue. And so you found people that were taking those courses that were interested, and I'm still in touch with a couple of my students that are matriculated through different law enforcement agencies, but I found that to be an effective way. And it's, I don't know if there's one way. It's a combination of things, I guess. What does the department have to offer the individual? Because there are a lot of good folks out there that would love to do what we've done, but they may be in a town that's kind of not a good place to be, and so they're off course there. Does that make any sense?
A little bit.
I knew.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Sure.
If you were to run a PR agency for law enforcement, what would sort of be the message to the general public? How would you position law enforcement? What would you do to potentially change public perception that might be out there right now?
I would give specific examples of how law enforcement has not ended up on the front page, but has saved lives, have helped kids, and really kind of give a good overview of what a day-to-day, work-a-day world is with these young people, basically. And because it's not going to end up on the front page, the good things that are done. And so explaining and having legitimate examples of what they do, I think would be helpful. And that's me. That's a simplistic answer, but that's really what I would do.
Chief Robin Montgomery, I am so thankful I had the opportunity to meet you. I'm so thankful that we collectively had the opportunity to sort of hear your story. I'm so appreciative that you came in to tell that story today. I'm really, really deeply thankful, and I hope this comes across in a very heartfelt way, that there are men like you, that people like you have been willing to dedicate their lives to service to this country and service to your community. It really does blow me away, your story particularly. So my first wish for you is that you have many, many more peaceful years in your well-earned retirement, and that you can enjoy yourself and spend time with your kids and your grandkids for as long as you're able. My second wish for you is that Darren is able to get you tickets to the game where Ovi breaks Wayne Gretzky's record.
That could be a tough one.
Sir, it has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
And I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.